Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming to Humanities Decanted, the IHC's informal showcase in which faculty members present and discuss their newest research and creative work. My name is Susan Derwin, and I'm the director of the Humanities Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located, and I would like to pay respects to elders, both past and present. I am delighted to welcome Vladimir Hamed-Troyansky, Assistant Professor of Global Studies. He is a historian of global migration and forced displacement with expertise in the Ottoman and Russian empires and their successor states. His research has been supported by, among others, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Social Science Research Council, and his articles have appeared in Past and Present, Comparative Studies in Society and History, International Journal of Middle East Studies, Slavic Review, and Kritika. He will be in dialogue today about his new book, Empires of Refugees, North Caucasian Muslims and the Late Ottoman State, which appeared this year with Stanford University Press. His scheduled interlocutor, who may as yet appear, we're not sure, is Dwight Reynolds, and I will introduce him in absentia. He is Distinguished Professor of Arabic Language and Literature in the Department of Religious Studies and an affiliate faculty member of 4 other departments, including Music and Comparative Literature. Dwight has published, translated, or edited 9 books, including most recently, The Musical Heritage of Al-Andalus. Now, see? Dwight, I've just introduced you. All right. Vladimir will begin with a short presentation, and then he and Dwight will speak with each other for about 30 minutes. Following their conversation, we will open up discussion to you, our audience members, so you can ask questions and share your thoughts. And this is very important. Please feel free to continue to enjoy the snacks and drinks during the event. This is intended to sort of listen and masticate and meditate and what's another M thing? I thought of one. I'm not going to say it. Okay. So enjoy the event. We're going to start with Vladimir's presentation. Nice to see you, Dwight. And here we go. So, Vladimir, please.
My goodness, thank you so much to everyone for being here. It's so special to have this delayed launch with family. Thank you for being here. Many thanks to the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center for hosting this. Many thanks to Susan, and many thanks to Dwight for being a discussant. So I'm going to present very briefly my first book, Empire of Refugees, North Caucasian Muslims and the Late Ottoman State. And it was published earlier this year in February by Stanford University Press. And also, this book is dedicated to my husband, Ronnie. Where is he? There he is. And this book would not be possible without him. Okay. So, this book, I'm a historian of migration and forced displacement, and my regional expertise is in the Middle East and the former Russian Empire. And this book looks at the displacement and resettlement of about 1 million refugees, Muslim refugees who were expelled or who emigrated from the Caucasus within the Russian Empire and who were resettled throughout the Ottoman Empire. So it is a story of this massive refugee diaspora and how they transformed the late Ottoman Middle East and the late Ottoman Balkans. This book also tells a bigger story, a story of how the 2 empires, the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire, were managing Muslim migration and Muslim mobility. This story tells the origins of organized refugee resettlement in the Middle East. And I'll start with the general structure of the book. So the book has 7 chapters, and the first 2 provide a broad overview of trans-imperial mobility. Those 2 chapters are very assignable in courses on global migration, the Middle East, and Russia. So the first chapter looks at what happened on the Russian side of the border, why there were so many Muslim refugees in the late imperial period, that is, from the mid-19th century all the way to the outbreak of World War I. Chapter 2 looks at what was happening on the Ottoman side of the border, and how come the Ottoman government was so welcoming to all those refugees from different ethnic groups from the North Caucasus. And we're talking about 30 different ethnic groups, including Circassians, Abkhazians, Ossetians, Chechens, and many others. The Ottoman government became one of the world's largest refugee hosting states in the 19th century, and I'm explaining why that happened. And then the next 3 chapters are regional. I focus on the political economy of refugee resettlement in 3 different parts of the empire. They're the 3 historic regions of the Ottoman state: the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Levant. And I'm looking at the resettlement in different regions with very different environmental conditions. So, for example, in Jordan, the Levant, I am looking at the resettlement of refugees in the semi-arid desert conditions in a place that became Amman. Amman, right now, is the capital city of Jordan. It has the population of over 4 million people. It recently became the largest city in the Levant, but in 1878, it was a refugee village that was founded by these newcomers, Muslim refugees from the Russian Empire, the Circassians. So I'm telling the origin story of the largest city in the Levant in this book. And then the final 2 chapters in the book are thematic. I'm looking at different strategies that refugees took to survive. So chapter 6 looks at the evolution of the North Caucasian diaspora, and then the final chapter takes us full circle and looks at those refugees who decided not to stay in the Middle East and who tried to return back home to the Caucasus under Russian rule. I designed this book with multiple fields in mind and multiple audiences in mind. So this book makes contributions to global history, global migration and refugee studies, Middle Eastern and Ottoman history and studies, and Russian and Eastern European history and studies. So this book makes 3 big arguments. The first argument, the core argument, is that between 1860 and World War I, the Ottoman government established a refugee regime for incoming Muslims. When we think about refugee regimes, we usually think about the 20th century, the end of World War II, the establishment of the United Nations and the UN Refugee Agency, and the contemporary refugee regime. So here, in this book, I show that already in the second half of the 19th century, a Muslim country, the Ottoman Empire, created a package of refugee protections that was very similar to what we would expect today. So, in the field of global history and global migration and refugee studies, I'm offering a much earlier timeline to think about the history of global refugee protections. The second argument is in the field of Middle Eastern studies. I'm showing that Muslim refugee resettlement fortified Ottoman rule in the outlying regions of the Levant and Anatolia and accelerated the collapse of the empire in the Balkans. So it dives into the big debate about how the Ottoman Empire ended and how the Middle East was reconstructed in the early 20th century. Historians usually explain the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire either by looking at geopolitics, the Ottomans were losing all their wars, or by looking at cultural forces like sectarianism and nationalism that destroyed how people were relating to each other. I am showing that Muslim refugee resettlement was very important to this process because it had 2 consequences. In the Balkans, it actually accelerated the collapse of the empire because refugee resettlement was mismanaged there. And then in some regions, in nomadic regions of the empire, it strengthened imperial rule. The Ottomans were actually at their strongest in parts of the Levant and Anatolia precisely at the moment of the collapse of the empire. And then finally, in the field of Russian, Eastern European, and Eurasian studies, I'm showing that Imperial Russia attempted to control Muslim mobility to consolidate its authority in the Caucasus. So through various migration policies, through the Muslim migration bans on return migration, and migration bans on emigration, and forced expulsions, Russia was managing its Muslim empire that stretched from Crimea and the Caucasus through Central Asia all the way to Siberia. In this field of Russian Eastern European history, we talk quite a bit about decolonization, especially after Russia's genocidal full-scale assault on Ukraine. So if we think about the territorial evolution of Russia, the regions that Russia conquered in the 18th and 19th centuries since then became independent. It's Ukraine, Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, the South Caucasus states, and Central Asia. The one region that hasn't is the North Caucasus. So this book provides one of the explanations for what happened there, why this happened. Massive displacement of native indigenous Muslim communities, and then settler colonialism that was unleashed, the arrival of Slavic and Christian settlers. So these are the three arguments. And finally, I want to say a few words about the evidence for this book. So this book is based on research, primarily in Arabic, Ottoman and modern Turkish, Russian and Bulgarian, in over 20 archives in 10 countries, because I couldn't stop. And it's a history of migration, and it operates on several levels. On one level, it's the study of imperial migration policies. And I was reconstructing bit by bit the legislation and the infrastructure that the Ottomans and the Russians set up to manage Muslim mobility. And I was using all kinds of state sources for this. So I was looking at land records and tax registers, population censuses, court records. But it's also a bottom-up history of refugee migration. It was very important for me to show how refugees themselves, Muslim refugees, were perceiving their displacement and resettlement. So I was looking for refugee voices in the archives and elsewhere, and I found quite a bit. I found many family letters preserved in private collections by descendants of refugees in the Middle East, and I also worked with hundreds of refugee petitions. And I also got to interview people. I interviewed descendants of Circassian and Chechen refugees in Jordan and in Turkey. All right, I'm going to stop here, and then we're going to have a discussion. I'm very much looking forward to speaking with Dwight. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Vladimir. It's a great pleasure to be here. The book itself is absolutely extraordinary. I urge you all to buy a copy and enjoy reading it. It's also incredibly rich in terms of the various different layers of argumentation that you've had just a taste of in this presentation. One of the things that most struck me was what you showed in your last slide, and that was the use of so many different historical forms of documentation. And so I wanted to ask you first about these. You were in 24 different archives in X number of countries, you couldn't stop, etc. What type of, there are many people in this room who actually conduct their research using archival sources. What type of experiences did you have accessing those resources? Did you find resistance? Was it easy? Did you find people helpful? Did you find people that were not helpful? Did you have any amazing moments, those aha moments of discovery, something particularly special?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dwight. Is it on? Yeah, okay. So I was quite fortunate during archival research. I got into every archive I wanted to go to, so there were no really... and that kind of research would not be possible today because I did research in Russia, as you saw on the map. So of course, right now, Russia is out of the picture because of its assault on Ukraine, but also because of this topic. Already conducting this research in the 2010s, this topic has everything to do with what happened to Muslim communities in the Caucasus. There was an ethnic cleansing. Many scholars consider it a genocide, a Circassian genocide against the indigenous Circassian communities. So it was not a topic that was welcomed by the authorities already back then. Today, it would be impossible, it would be dangerous to conduct any kind of research in Russia on this. But actually, I had a fantastic time in the North Caucasus archives. People, the archivists, were incredible because it is their history and because they knew that this topic, the topic of genocide, the topic of what happened in the 19th century, was such a taboo topic. And so they were so happy that, that is gaining traction and people are working on it. I was incredibly fortunate in Jordan. And Jordan was the very first country I went to do my field work. I managed to gain access to all real estate transactions for the entire city of Amman in its first 40 years. And late Ottoman land records, it's a very rare kind of source for Middle Eastern history because they still have judicial value. So those land records that are in Turkey, they're kept in Ankara under lock because people could start asking all kinds of questions about what happened during World War I and the Armenian genocide. So in Jordan, I somehow managed to get the security clearance, I don't know how, through the Jordanian Interior Ministry. They just called me up and they said that we approve. I was allowed to sit in an office with 3 Jordanian officials who are incredible for 3 weeks. And during those 3 weeks, they were constantly receiving petitioners. So Palestinians, Jordanians, Circassians, who would come and lay some kind of requests about the land. So I got to witness live that those land records, they actually have judicial value today. And that's why they're so guarded by the state. But I was given access to all the land records for the late Ottoman period. I was not allowed to take a laptop or a phone. I had to take everything, copy everything by hand in pencil. But now I have a full database of every single transaction that happened in Amman in its first 40 years, which allows me to make all the calculations about political economy, about real estate prices. Another experience that I still remember, when I was working in Bulgaria, Bulgaria has the 3rd largest Ottoman archive in the world, after Istanbul and Cairo. But very few people get to work there because all the cataloging is done in Bulgarian. So essentially to work there, you need to know Ottoman Turkish in the Arabic script, and you need to know Cyrillic, right? So it wasn't super popular among Turkish historians. But so there, and many documents are not cataloged. So they would still bring you some boxes, and it's up to you to discover what's in them. So I remember getting one document. It was a population register for Circassian refugee villages, and it was sewn up. So it was sewn up in 1877, and that thread was still there. And so the archivist had to cut the thread, and I guess I was the first person who actually got to open and breathe the archival dust. So yeah, but because I went to all those places and different archives, that allowed me to tell this story in different registers, kind of a comprehensive picture of that's how 1 million refugees settled, but also go in depth into that's the political economy of some small villages and clusters of villages. And also tell the story of that's how the 2 empires were managing migration. And also that's how refugees themselves, how they were resisting all kinds of state policies and how they were trying to negotiate with the state.
One of the other things that's so striking is the way you move back and forth between, as you say, these larger processes that are going on that you've derived from state documents, and then move into personal letters, family histories like the Khotat family. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Anyway, or the original settlers of Amman. What was it like for you to read all of these personal letters going back and forth between the northern Caucasus out into the diaspora? The one story that sticks with my mind was the family who didn't know how to reach their relative. Was it a brother? I can't remember. And he just sends it with pilgrims heading toward Mecca and say, every time you see a Circassian village, ask whether they know so-and-so, right? And it got to him eventually. And so they established And then they used pilgrims going to and forth Mecca as their postmen to go to carry letters in Circassians from various parts in the Levant back up to northwestern Caucasus. What was it like to read all of these deeply personal and emotional records?
So I was looking for those private letters for a long time. And so as I went to Jordan, as I started interviewing people, which I did not expect that I would be doing when I went to do the field work. And I kept asking people, like, do your families have any private letters? Have you heard of such a source? And usually the answer was no. It would happen 150 years ago. Those kind of sources would not have survived. In Turkey, there's also another layer. The letters would be in the Arabic script, which in Turkey most people would not be able to read it these days. So really those documents, they are very rare. So I kept asking and asking, and then in Jordan, on my very last day in Jordan, I got a call from my interlocutor saying, there's someone who wants to meet you. Like, let's go sit down for tea. So we went to the Circassian Charitable Association in Amman, and so we're sipping tea, and then a man shows up. And it was a man from the Hutat family, and he was carrying a folder with 58 letters in Ottoman Turkish, right? And so he asked me if I might be interested in writing the history of their family, if I might be interested in those letters. And I actually have a slide that I can show. And so thanks to those letters, I got to reconstruct a family history of the Hutats. So 58 letters. One man, this man, Fuat Hutat, is writing them. And the family is moving from the Caucasus to Istanbul, then different parts of Anatolia, western, eastern, southern, and central, and then all the way to a tiny refugee village of Amman where they initially don't want to be, because it's on the edge of the Syrian desert, there's nothing there. But then eventually they move there, they buy land there, and like many Circassians in Amman, they did quite well for themselves. But those letters, they were absolutely incredible because they provide the kind of perspective on refugee resettlement that we can't really get in the state archive. So, for example, this family, they didn't intend for those letters to be seen by the state. They were discussing how to negotiate with the authorities. They were discussing different strategies they could use to better their fate, to gather all of the family in one place, to establish a new Circassian village, to invite everyone to live there together. The letters are also sentimental. Fuat Hutat wrote about how much he misses the homeland and how, what a tragedy it is that they are displaced and they had to rebuild everything in the Ottoman Empire. He talked about the new generation, the Hutat children, and that he hopes, their lives would be better than the previous generations. He was writing that they should be good Ottoman children and study Ottoman Turkish. They should also stay good Circassian children and practice horse riding every day. So these letters are amazing. It's a rare kind of source, but they really provide the kind of perspective we don't often hear. And I also got to find letters in the Russian archives in the North Caucasus. These were the letters that refugees sent back home to the Caucasus. And those letters were smuggled. So late 19th, early 20th centuries, letters written in Arabic and Ottoman Turkish. But they are preserved in the archive because they were captured by the Russian authorities. And that's how they make it to the archive, right? So there are many layers to those letters and why they were apprehended and how they were translated and what the authorities made of them. So I also tell the story of how the Russian authorities were terrified of any kind of communication between the diaspora and North Caucasian Muslims. What kind of things are they talking about? Like, what could that be? So, yeah.
As you know, I have a bit of an interest in languages. And I'm also a folklorist, so I'm also very interested in oral traditions. So one of the things that's striking is to think of these muhajir, or these refugees, coming from the Northern Caucasus, speaking a variety of languages. And most of them they don't even have an alphabet. They are, this purely oral tradition. Languages, a couple of which have actually died, have gone extinct. They are complicated languages. One of the things that I love about this area is that this area has the languages that have the most number of consonants for the fewest number of vowels. So Übich has 85 phonemic consonants and only 3 vowels. So these people, go off to out into the diaspora. They're either forced out, they've gone out on their own as muhajirs seeking a better life. And now, as you said, we talked about some of the letters being written back in Ottoman Turkish and perhaps some in Russian, I don't know. But what strikes me is reading about their efforts, as you say, the Circassian wants the children to be good Ottomans and learn Ottoman Turkish, but he also wants them to be good Circassians. And so he wants them to learn Circassian, or whichever form of Circassian. There are several different forms. Anyway, could you tell us the story? I mean, you said it in the book, but I was fascinated by the attempts at creating, how do you support a diasporic identity without a written language?
Yeah, thank you. This refugee diaspora is really a unique case in global history, because from the get-go they were positioning themselves as a multi-ethnic, multilingual refugee diaspora, because there were so many different ethnic groups represented there. And also their development of their identities in the Ottoman Empire, it was preceding nation-making in the Caucasus, which is the story of Soviet North Caucasus 1930s onwards. So it is quite remarkable. So most of them arrived with their languages not having the literary tradition, right? And they had to study either Ottoman Turkish or Arabic in their schools in the Ottoman Empire. And the first two generations, they were refugees. They were trying to survive. They were trying not to die in their new empire. Then we have the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 in the Ottoman Empire that changes everything. So that year is the first year when a diasporic association can be established. Not just for them, but also for many other communities in the empire. So they established this association that tries to speak for about 1 million refugees. And they're starting to grapple with, who are we? No, we know who we are, but how do we present ourselves to the Ottoman government and to our neighbors? And so the decision is made, kind of the consensus, that let's present ourselves as Circassians, because that's the term that most people in the Middle East know, that's how most people refer to us anyway, and that's the numerical majority of the diaspora. But then they start developing languages and putting them on script. And multiple issues emerge. The first issue is, what kind of script should we use? Should we use the Arabic script, or should we use the Latin script? The Latin script is much better for so many consonants, as you said, but then the Latin script is associated with Christian communities in the Ottoman Empire. The only Muslim community that is beginning to play with the Latin alphabet is Albanians at the time. And then the Arabic script, it's not as great for the sounds, but is associated with Muslim communities, and that's the script that literate people in the diaspora would know. So for a time, in the 1900s, 1910s, they're doing both. And so their very first newspaper, the very first Circassian newspaper is in the Ottoman Empire, not in Russia. Like, it's playing with both of those scripts, and people are trying to learn both. And then, starting in the 1930s, already in the Soviet Union, the languages are being laid onto the Cyrillic script. So now we have 3 scripts, especially Latin script and the Cyrillic script, that are ongoing. In 2015, recently, the Turkish government for the first time allowed the teaching of Circassian in several universities in Turkey. And the Turkish government mandated that the text that should be used in those courses should be written in the Latin script. But much of the diaspora in Turkey today, and it's up to 3 million people who descend from those refugees, the main diasporic associations were actually against that decision, and they wanted the texts to be studied at universities to be in Cyrillic, to maintain some kind of continuity with the cultural production in the former Soviet Union and now the Russian Federation. Because the community has suffered so much, right, over 150 years of separation from their homeland, that the more connection they maintain today, even if that means that people growing up speaking Turkish mostly now have to also learn the Cyrillic script, but for many people in the diaspora, it's worth it to maintain that kind of connection. Then there was also the issue of which dialect to choose for the Circassian language, because roughly 12 different dialects exist of Circassian, and the dialects that are represented in the diaspora are different from the dialects that are represented in the Caucasus because of that scale of displacement, right? So the way the language was codified in the Middle East is slightly different the way the language was codified during the Soviet period back in the homeland. It's not an easy story.
Yes, absolutely, an amazing story. One of the things that toward the end of your volume, which is so rich in so many different ways, that's striking is that you were able to follow up with actual human interviews with the descendants of this process that began 150 years earlier, whenever you want to. How much identity did you find among these descendants? And can you tell us a little bit about which groups are actually beginning to consider or have started doing back migration back into their homelands? The one example I know is that Abkhazia, the little tiny break-off country next to Georgia, started a repatriation program or a law of return, in some sense similar to Israel and to Finland, which also has a Finnic law of return. And if you can prove that you are in any way descended from a Abkhazian muhajir, whereas many Syrians were, you had the right to return to Abkhazia and obtain citizenship, which began to pick up, of course, during the Syrian civil war. But that is the one example I know, and you tell a much richer story. So first tell us about what was it like speaking to people who were the descendants of this process that you had documented, and do they still say, I'm Circassian? What do they mean by that? And do any of them have any interest in actually moving back to the Caucasus or to the Black Sea area in general?
So it's a massive diaspora, right? Up to 3 million people in Turkey. It's the largest ethnic minority in Turkey after the Kurds and now after the Syrians as well. Also large communities in Syria, in Jordan, in Iraq, and several other countries in the Middle East. The sense of identity is actually incredibly strong. The language may be lost for most people. Most people would grow up speaking Turkish or Arabic, depending on where they ended up in the Late Ottoman period. But there is a sense that no, but we are Circassian and Ossetian and Abkhazian. And there are multiple elements to their identity, and those elements, they were kind of codified in the Late Ottoman period by this first diasporic association that I mentioned. So first, it's the ethnic identity, right? Circassian or Abkhazian. Then it's this multilingual, multi-ethnic identity. We are North Caucasians in the Middle East. Then there's a strong sense of Muslim identity, in large part because of these people were displaced from the North Caucasus, in large part because they were Muslims, and of what the Russian government and the Russian military made of their identity, and what it meant to have Muslims living in the borderlands. So, and of course, what it means to be Muslim, it underwent such an evolution in different parts of the Middle East in the 20th century. And then another layer of the identity is the civic identity, right? That is fused with loyalty to a new nation state and the host community. So I'm Turkish, I'm Lebanese, I'm Syrian, I'm Iraqi. So this community is negotiating multiple identities, but the fundamentals of that politics, it's really been set over a century ago. In terms of repatriation, Abkhazia is a phenomenal case study, but it's an outlier in a way. It's a de facto independent state, a breakaway province of Georgia. They can do their own things when it comes to immigration. Much of the North Caucasus, well, no, the entire North Caucasus, is within the Russian Federation. So the immigration laws there are governed by the federal authorities out of Moscow. And the Russian government never recognized. There are two issues that are critical for the diaspora in the Middle East today, two sensitive political issues. First is the recognition of the Circassian genocide, which Russia absolutely refuses to acknowledge. And the second issue, it's the right of return, having the right of mass return to the homeland, which again, Russia refuses to acknowledge. So we see a lot of continuity here between actually the Russian government, the Soviet government, and the Russian imperial government. In the 1990s, when the Soviet Union fell apart, it was the first time when many people in the diaspora actually could go back to the Caucasus. So many people went there as tourists, and some even tried to stay. And several thousand people officially immigrated in the North Caucasus and became Russian citizens. But the administrative process is very burdensome. And these people, Russia didn't recognize their right of return based on their ethnicity, as opposed to many ethnic Russians who actually can immigrate in Russia based on their ethnic status and easily get the naturalization and benefits, etc. So as you can imagine, it's a very sore point. It's a tragedy for the diaspora. The right of return is incredibly important for the North Caucasians, but also other refugee communities in the Middle East, the Palestinians, the Armenians, and the others.
I wonder if I can ask you to explain, give us a little explanation of the cover of your book. Do you have a slide of it? There are many riches therein. And,
Okay, I'm very happy about the cover. Stanford University Press is very happy about the cover as well. So there is this incredible artist, Zeina Assaid. She's Jordanian Circassian, and she's a collage artist. So her art is very much inspired by her Circassian and North Caucasian heritage. And I've been following Zeina on Instagram for many years, and I was always dreaming that one day, perhaps, she might be willing to lend her art to the cover of this book. And so I had this conversation with Stanford University Press. They asked me what I wanted to have on the cover. So I got in touch with Zeina, and she was incredibly generous. She allowed this piece, original artwork, to be featured on the cover. And then she and Stanford, they made it work. But the title of this original artwork is Family Tree, which I think is also very fitting for the book, because I'm telling all those different family histories and how they really, this bottom-up story, how they change our understanding of refugee resettlement and how it actually proceeded in practice. And also the genealogy of refugee knowledge and what refugees needed to know to survive in the empire. Again, something that we don't really see in the archive. But there's more to this story, because when the cover was finalized, I realized that when I went to Jordan over 10 years ago to start my fieldwork, I started interviewing people. And there was this very first group of people whom I interviewed, several Circassian women with whom I was speaking about their ancestors, their arrival, the establishment of Amman, and Zeina's mother was one of those women in that group. So this book, it started in Amman and it ended in Amman, and it started and ended with one family, which is incredibly meaningful to me. So, yeah. Yes. So it's collage art. So this is a historical photograph. It was probably taken in the Caucasus, this picture of a Circassian man. And then there are several other portraits, right, representing members of the same family. And there are also some symbols that are important in Circassian and North Caucasian mythologies. So horses play quite a big story in the story of resettlement, because many refugees who came to the Middle East by land, they managed to bring their horses, which then became one of the main exports for those communities, because the Ottoman army was willing to buy those horses. So, and that's part of the story of militarization of that community and how they came to play a big part during World War I, and then in the establishment of new independent nation states and the mandates in the Middle East, and what kind of military experience they had to offer the new governments. Then there's a wolf. A wolf is very important in mythology for Circassians and for Turks and for many others. Yeah.
touched upon, in many ways, not for us in the West, but in many ways for certain audiences, these are controversial topics. You're talking about the Circassian genocide, you are talking about forced displacements, you are talking about refugees, you are talking about people wanting to return, not being given a right to return, etc. So I guess I'm interested in knowing what reception the book has had so far.
Yeah, thank you. The reception so far has been incredible, and I'm very grateful to so many people engaging with the book. And I got to present this book to different academic communities. So to different Middle East studies centers around the country, and Russian, Eastern European, and Eurasian studies centers, global migration, global studies, global history communities. And so it was incredible to see what kind of questions arise. But also, so I gave 27 book talks since March. I was on a sabbatical for a year. I just came back. I also got to do talks in Turkey. I was a Fulbright scholar in Turkey, so I got to present in Istanbul, and the reception there and how they engage with this topic. Because for so many academics and members of the general public, it's such a personal story, the story of this massive refugee diaspora. So that's been incredible. I got to present I gave an online talk in Jordan, in Amman, and also in the United States. I was invited by the main Circassian association, diasporic association in North America, who are based in New Jersey, northern New Jersey, and that's been incredible, because it was during Ramadan, so we waited until dinner for the community to break fast, and so my talk was scheduled for 10 p.m. on Friday night, right? And so it was the main building of the Circassian Association, and there were young kids, and then there were elders in their 70s and 80s, and the story, it was so personal, it was so meaningful to people. I'm incredibly grateful for that kind of interest and for the acceptance, right, of this book. This book is currently being translated into Turkish and Russian. I just signed the contracts, and in Turkey it's going to be translated by one of the large commercial publishing houses. So it will go straight to bookstores. So again, for me, from the get-go, it was very important that this research is actually accessible in the regions that I study, both in the diaspora, but also in the broader Turkish and Arab, right, and the North Caucasian communities in the Russian Federation. So I'm very excited about this development.
Are all the beneficiaries of the fact that you seem to have magically hit that little gap in history where you were able to get to those archives before they were shut down, and that you might not have been able to gain access to earlier on. We gain from the academic knowledge that you have brought to us, which is really quite extraordinary on so many different levels. But I think just in what you have just said about the Circassian, at a human level, we gain because you've told a story that had not been told, that needed to be told, and that has offered Circassians and other North Caucasus peoples, Mohajirs, exiles, displaced people, an opportunity for their identity and for their story to reach a broader audience. And for that, I think we all thank you.
Vladimir, congratulations.
Thank you, Shemaine.
As your colleagues who have watched you develop this over years, it's really beautiful to see this come to fruition, and I am so proud to be your friend and colleague and amazed at what you've done. I have two very simple questions. The first is sort of just thinking about how daunting it might seem to grad students and to lesser scholars like myself listening to the amount of work that you've done for this project. So could you just say a little bit about what allows you to do the scope of work that you've done with this project? Does it take particular genius? Are you just smarter than the rest of us? Is it about perseverance? Is there a personal story and a drive that sort of led you to this particular gap in history that was sort of also specific to your personal story? So can you just give us a sense of how you came to this project and what positions you in a way to be able to answer this story in a way that has made this such a special book? And then the second question is simpler and shorter. It's just, what is the work that the concept of empire is doing for you?
Simple questions. Thank you Thank you, esteemed, brilliant colleague who is working on 2 incredible books right now, and a neighbor. So, okay, when I was doing, this is the first book, right? So it's a significant reworking of the dissertation. When I was doing the dissertation, I wasn't sure how it was all gonna come up together, right? And I didn't plan for 10 countries. It was 7 countries in the beginning, then it became 10. But at the end of the dissertation, I had disparate case studies, right, throughout the empire. So it took me a while to take a step back, like when I was already at UCSB, and to think about the bigger picture and what kind of story I want to tell, but also what the bigger contributions to the field. And that's what I started with, the 3 arguments would be. So it was really kind of, and so my arguments, they operate on very much kind of like a broader, not the micro-histories, the refugee resettlement and the case studies, but kind of the biggest story. And it took a while to get there. And I had to do a lot of extra research. I had to really dive into legislation, both Ottoman and Russian legislation that was completely disparate, right? And recollect sources and do additional research. So yes, that's the answer to the first. No, no, no one is. You are a genius. Okay, and then the empires. So it's very much a work of trans-imperial history, right? Because it operates on multiple levels. It's about, well, first of all, it's of course the policies of the different empires, right? And it's a comparative study of those policies. But one of the bigger arguments is that the empires were governing, especially the borderlands, through migration policies. And it might seem that they were doing very different things. They were doing opposite things. The Russians were expelling Muslim communities out of the Caucasus, resettling everything with Slavs and Christians. The Ottomans were welcoming Muslim communities, Muslim refugees, and at the same time, there was the slow evolution of ethnic cleansing that eventually culminates in the Armenian and Greek and Assyrian genocide, right? So the opposite things in a way, but at the same time, their policies, they serve the same goal, strengthening imperial rule. For Russia to hold the Caucasus, for the Ottomans to hold whatever is left of the empire, right? So that's kind of one of the big arguments that I'm making. But also, in terms of kind of trans-imperial, I was looking at how refugees themselves were positioning themselves between the empires and how they are victims of horrendous things, of ethnic cleansing, of genocide, but I was looking for their agency because there was so much agency. And so that allows me to really gain this trans-imperial dimension. How were they negotiating with the empires, and how were they, even when they couldn't negotiate, what kind of strategies they chose to better their fate, right? And of course, the different identities that they got to negotiate. Muslim, Circassian, Russian subject, Ottoman subject, no one subject, things like that. So I think these are the 2 main ways I'm engaging with empire. Thank you, Charmaine.
Well, thank you so much for letting us into this book. I can't wait to spend more time with it. I guess my question, I would like to return to the correspondence you introduced us to, and I'm still thinking about it, and I'm wondering, so this is a correspondence which was kept among different refugee communities. So can you perhaps say a little bit who is participating in this correspondence in terms of their class status? Yeah, I guess not everybody was literate, so it has to be a specific type of people. And second, does this correspondence kind of give you insight to what extent this history is contested? Are there perhaps different types of narratives what this expulsion and resettlement was about, and that probably the different archives you've looked at gave you different stories, and to what extent then, you know, from the micro level, it gave you a different explanation or a different interpretation?
Thank you. Thank you so much for another simple question. So who was writing those letters? Of course, only literate people could be writing them. So primarily it's the story of I guess the upper status refugees, like the Hutat family, who had the education, who had the means to do that kind of correspondence. Many members of the ulama, or the Muslim religious elite, right, with education, you know, in Arabic, sometimes in Persian, in Ottoman Turkish, sometimes they were writing on behalf of the communities. They were writing petitions, but they were also writing letters. But it was actually, I think it was also a larger process, because there's one story that I found out. Okay, let me tell you a story of this place. So this is, oh, yeah. This is a map that serves a big part in this book. It's, I've been working on it for a while. It's based on my research and the work of North Caucasian activists in the Middle East who made their data publicly available. But these are over 1,100 refugee villages that were set up in the Middle East in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And they're color-coded for different ethnic groups. So as you see, the geography of resettlement, it was almost every Ottoman province. People settled in what today are 14 different nation states, because some of them are also in the Balkans. But so there's this fascinating place called Uzun Yayla. It's right over here. It's in central Anatolia, to the right of Kayseri. Okay, imagine. You're standing 5,000 feet up, right, in the mountains, and you're in a valley, which is kind of like a bowl. And on all four sides, you're surrounded by mountains. And then there's a mountain river that is rushing through the valley, and then escapes the valley through one opening. And then it snakes its way all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And then that valley, at that opening, Circassian refugees established a refugee town that would sort of seal the valley and then guard the valley. And then in that refugee valley, high up, well, in the mountain valley, it becomes a refugee valley because 40,000 North Caucasian refugees established over 70 villages. So it kind of becomes a refugee country in the very middle, geographic middle of the Ottoman Empire, in central Anatolia. So I found out that there were some letters that were originating in that valley and that they were being smuggled back to the Caucasus. And so they were smuggled by some individuals. It was kind of a highly organized operation. One person would smuggle between like 60, 70, 80 different letters. And some of those letters were written by farmers, by people who couldn't write, so someone was writing on their behalf. So there were all kinds of communications going on. Again, we know about those letters, it's a tragic story, because they were apprehended. And then because of the Russian authorities overreacted, and they actually banned any kind of communication between the diaspora and the North Caucasian communities, and they were heavily policing and militarizing the Russo-Ottoman border. But in terms of the tensions, diaspora has been in exile for 150 years and more for some of them. There are all kinds of tensions. And it's been incredibly hard for many North Caucasians in Turkey. Between 1923 and the 1950s, people couldn't publicly speak their North Caucasian languages. They couldn't establish diasporic associations because of the heavy Turkification policy. So they were keeping their non-Turkish ethnic status on the down low. And so language was often lost, and there's a lot of trauma stemming from this. So we have to unveil many layers, right, of how the diaspora evolved into the 21st century to really understand how it feels about its origins, where it originated, and what its relationship with the Caucasus should be right now. So kind of the dominant narrative for many descendants of refugees is the Circassian genocide right now, rightfully so. But this really was not discussed before the 1980s, 1990s openly. It's kind of a new thing when people can't speak about it openly, which is an incredible thing. But communities are very different. Some of them left for different reasons. This summer I was doing field work in a Dagestani Sufi village in Turkey, which has been incredible. And so for them, the story of displacement is completely different. So much of the diaspora would commemorate 1864 as the year of the Circassian genocide, the displacement from the Caucasus, the loss of the motherland. But then this community, they would commemorate the date of entry into the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic because that was the safe haven for them. So they would not emphasize the displacement, they would emphasize kind of the arrival. So communities are very different, and again, they're in such different regions in the Middle East, there's so many layers to what the tensions are today.
Hi. I guess I wanted to jump back to sort of the Ottoman historiographic question in a sense, because you talked about sort of the effect in the Balkans and the failure of building a regime in a similar way. I mean, a lot of the areas where they're settling them, they need people there. These are places that they're trying to incorporate into something new. And I think that, you know, if I guess you're arguing that the failure in the Balkans helps to precipitate the sort of long-term effects within the Ottoman Empire. I mean, I can think of sort of ricochet effects and insecurity that even lead into sort of the Armenian genocide in some ways. And I guess I was hoping you could maybe speak more on that question, because it seems like a long time ago, it's not irrelevant to the moment and into understanding how these processes happen.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, the Ottomans, like any other successful empire, they're learning from their mistakes. So what happened in the Balkans in the 1860s and 1870s, about up to 500,000 refugees were resettled in the Balkans, and it ended up in a tragedy, in a lot of violence. There was sectarian violence that was emerging between different Muslim and Christian communities. Refugee resettlement was very unpopular with their neighbors. So this is one of the things that this book explores. It's refugee migration, immigration, and how tightly related to settler colonialism it is. Because from the perspectives of virtually everyone in the Middle East, these incoming refugees were settlers who were there to take their land. The government thought it's theirs to give, but then everyone on the ground did not agree with this, right? So we have a lot of violence in the Balkans, eventually the Russo-Ottoman War of 1877-78, and the Ottomans are expelled from territories that they held for 5 centuries. But they're learning from this, and they're learning all kinds of things. One of the things they're learning is that maybe we should allow refugees to establish mono-ethnic villages. Most villages that you saw on the map, they're actually mono-ethnic, so people got to preserve their culture because they were settled with people they emigrated with or were displaced with from the Caucasus. So that's one lesson they learned. But another lesson they learned is that we can actually be strategic about where we resettle refugees, because there's so much demographic and political value in where we place them. So after 1878, the empire is pretty strategic about it. And many refugees are being placed in the Greek and also Armenian areas, especially when it comes to Balkan Muslim refugees. So this is important. This refugee resettlement, which is a story of humanitarianism, it's some of the origins of humanitarianism as an ideology in the Middle East. It has everything to do with ethnic cleansing and genocide, because those two come together. The empire was planning to resettle some refugees in the places from which it expelled Ottoman Christians, some of whom were deported and eventually murdered in the Armenian genocide. So humanitarianism and ethnic cleansing, they very much come together, and that's the Ottoman case.
Hi, Vladimir. So congratulations, first of all, for this wonderful achievement. My question comes from sort of South Asia. In the second half of the 19th century, there were a lot of Indian Muslims who also moved into Turkey, and they did so after the failure of the 1857 rebellion in India, because the British Empire sort of blamed the Muslims for what occurred. So I was wondering, what was the kind of cosmopolitan atmosphere in Turkey at this point of time, where Muslims from different parts of the world were rubbing shoulders, and how deeply the Muslims were invested in the Ottoman Empire in some ways, because in India, after the defeat of the Ottomans in the First World War, I mean, there was a Khilafat movement that took place in support of the Ottomans, So I was just wondering, what can you say, if you could say something about this?
Thank you so much, Anshu. So in the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire, it's besieged by European empires on all sides. It's facing all kinds of wars. And so at this point, it's actually expanding its soft power. It's projecting it into many Muslim regions, especially South Asia and Central Asia, so which are under British and Russian dominion. And this story, Muslim refugee resettlement, is one of the points that they emphasize. Look at us. Look at us. We are the caliphate, the university recognized Sunni caliphate, and we're kind of a righteous one, and that's the good thing that we're doing. We're helping Muslims worldwide. So that was how they were increasing their external legitimacy with Muslims in South Asia and Central Asia. They were also collecting money. So there were quite some charity that was coming from India, from Pakistan, from Central Asian countries, specifically for the resettlement of Muslim refugees, but also for the Ottoman war effort in the wars that were being lost. I'm also currently working on the second book project that is about global hijra. So the ideological foundation of this Ottoman refugee regime, which is the big argument in the book, was hijra, which is this term from early Islamic history. It's about migration of Muslims from a non-Muslim territory or Muslim territory occupied by non-Muslims to a safe Muslim haven. And it was interpreted as a religious obligation, something that good Muslims should do to protect their faith. So now for the second book, I'm tracing the history of global hijra in the 19th, 20th, and potentially early 21st centuries. Because this term, it was so meaningful to so many displaced Muslim communities. Here in late Ottoman Empire, but also in the Balkans in the 20th century, and Central Asia in the interwar period, and of course the largest hijra was during the partition when so many Muslims from India moved to Pakistan. So it's going to be combining the story of the Middle East and Central Asia and South Asia. Let's hope it gets done.
You already answered a part of it. Again, congratulations. And like Dwight, I'm fascinated by the 8 languages in which you've done your research, besides the 24 archives. So I had a question about, you could have named this book, The Circassian Diaspora in the 19th century, 19th and 20th, and you didn't. So I'm wondering about the relationship between the term refugee and diaspora, because diaspora is an analytic one, right? But you speak so many languages, and I understand that refugee is an official designation in petitions, etc., right? So that's an overall. So you give us an architecture, actually, to understand this very complex thing. But in the different languages, do people understand themselves as first refugees and then diaspora in the sense that we think of it as a civic, transnational? Hijra is one way, you know, that may be recurrent. But is there a way in which these communities understand themselves as diaspora?
That's an incredible question. Thank you so much, Bishnu. So the main term that I'm operating in the book, and I haven't mentioned it yet, it's muhajir, which is this term from Arabic, Ottoman Turkish, and it's related to hijra that I just mentioned, right? And it can be translated in different ways into English. It is refugee, immigrant, and emigrant. But I'm also showing that from the perspective of many locals, it was also a settler, right? And I'm kind of like telling this multi-layered history. So refugee in the title, it is inevitably a translation of one facet of that much richer term that is very much grounded in Islamic history. So that's the term that everyone, like all those refugees operated with, they exclusively used that term, which was something new in Ottoman history. It really rises in popularity in the 19th century because the empire is on the defensive, because so many territories are occupied by the Europeans, and so this term, kind of like the return to Islamic roots in a way, and also protecting our people who are going through, you know, horrendous ethnic cleansing and genocide. So in terms of diaspora, again, the diaspora is the term that would inevitably be a translation of something, but the term muhajir it provides a different take on kind of refugee history, which is traditionally studied as a very Western and secular and Atlantic-centric refugee history. This is a completely different genealogy that is rooted in Islamic history and in the Middle East. So for people to call themselves muhajir, they have solidarity with all those generations that came before them wherever they were, right? The followers, the early followers of the Prophet Muhammad, the very first muhajirs in the 7th century, but also Muslims who were expelled from Andalus, Muslim Spain, right? 11th to, you would know this so much better than I do, to the 15th century, and also Bosnians and Albanians and many other, so it provides this incredible trans-Muslim solidarity across Eurasia and Africa, if you wish. So it is diaspora, but tapping into a completely different genealogy. Thank you.
Hi. So congratulations, this is incredible, and I've been really enjoying the big global picture, and I have all kinds of questions to follow up with you about the refugee regime and the governance, but I would like to just sort of change the channel a little bit, because there is this interweaving dimension of gender and gender relations. And any time we're talking, I mean, sort of my current obsession, anytime we're talking about population, we're talking about reproduction, and we're talking about family forms and family roles. And as these populations are moving across generations, and as they are settling in different areas, I imagine they're not all remaining monoethnic, right? And when we talk about multiple identities, if people are intermarrying, or, I mean, how does gender and reproduction play out in this incredibly rich and microcosmic story in compared to other refugee, if that, yeah.
Thank you so much, Alison. Yeah, so when it comes to finding refugee voices from the 19th century, as you can imagine, there are very few women's voices that are actually being recorded, but there are some, right? And that often comes through the private letters, maybe sometimes through petitions, but very, very few. I reconstruct another family history in Jordan through actually not the direct refugee voices, but through land records and court records. I reconstruct the story of the richest person in central Transjordan in the late Ottoman period, who was a Circassian refugee woman, who managed to assemble this massive land portfolio. So kind of that's one aspect of showing the role that refugee women played in constructing those identities. So there is one dimension of the story that I haven't mentioned yet, where gender plays a massive role. Enslavement and slavery play a huge role in the story. It goes through every single chapter of the book. Up to 10% of all refugees, as they came to the Middle East, they were enslaved by other refugees. And that is a taboo story. And many people, most people who were enslaved, they were refugee women. And in fact, the Ottoman slavery survives in the Ottoman Empire until the very end because of that original refugee crisis in the 1860s, the bloating of the refugee market. So many refugees becoming, were being sold, and that kind of becomes an upper middle class institution. So many more people in the empire get in preserving the institution of slavery because Circassian refugees, especially Circassian refugee women, become available. So that's another dimension. Then there's the dimension of preserving the cultural identity, which is of course being preserved very often by women in these refugee households. And yes, it becomes a very sensitive issue. It takes a long time to learn languages. Like that's what many of us who trained as historians do in graduate school. But so for this I was using Russian, which happens to be my native language. I also came into graduate school already with some Arabic, and then I picked up Ottoman Turkish and modern Turkish in graduate school. So these were really the three. Plus I took classes in Bulgarian in graduate school, so I could also read Bulgarian petitions. But these are the four languages. I was not using translators for this. Yeah, I have that too.
You said in the presentation that Russia has a forced expulsion and a ban on immigration. And it seemed to me sort of contradictory, and then I was wondering if you could explain that.
Thank you so much. So Russian migration policies from the Caucasus, it's actually a very comprehensive policy that the Russians were following. And the policy kind of flipped at some point, but so let me explain. In the 1860s, there was a policy of expulsions. So many Circassian villages were burned down by the Russian military, and that's how most people, half of the diaspora, became refugees, right? And now many Circassian activists since the 1990s call for the recognition of those atrocities as genocide. The Russian government was encouraging people to leave. It was paying for the boats to take refugees from the coast of the Caucasus, all the way to the Ottoman Empire. But then, in the late 1860s, Russia actually banned emigration from Muslim emigration from the Caucasus, because the fear was that the region would be depopulated, right? And we need labor for all kinds of new things in the Caucasus, right? As Russia was reconstructing the region. So they banned emigration. And then, in the very beginning, they also banned return migration, and they never allowed it again. So it might sound contradictory. How come you ban emigration, but also how come you don't allow people to come back? But those were actually sides of the same coin. Russia tried to keep the population separate, right? The diaspora that already became refugees, right? And people in the Caucasus, to keep as many Muslims there as possible. It didn't want to mix the populations so that they don't exchange ideas, so that people in the Caucasus not find out what life is like in the Ottoman Empire, and kind of vice versa as well. Yeah, and emigration continued from the Caucasus after the establishment of Russian rule. So even though emigration was illegal, right, or was incredibly difficult to achieve in legal ways, people were just emigrating without telling anyone. They would sell their houses and they would cross the Russian-Ottoman border into the Ottoman Empire at night, not to be noticed by anyone. So yeah.
Okay, well, this was just a fantastic conversation. We don't sell books here, but you would have sold out if we had 5 books. So thank you, congratulations. Thank you, Dwight, as always. You were a wonderful collaborator. And thank you all for participating.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, I really appreciate it. Thank you, Dwight, so much.